He believed he owned the kitchen, that every flame, every plate, every pair of eyes in that room answered to him. But he had no idea he had just invited his own downfall. The dining room of Laurent Atelier glowed under warm amber lights, crystal glasses catching reflections as servers moved like clockwork between tables where guests in tailored suits and evening dresses whispered about the legendary chef Victor Laurent, the man who turned ingredients into status symbols, the man who decided who belonged and who didn't. And then there was her. Emily Carter stepped quietly through the entrance, her faded denim jacket slightly wrinkled, her shoes worn from long days, her presence almost invisible against the polished marble floors that echoed with confidence and wealth. She didn't announce herself, didn't demand attention, just stood there for a moment as if measuring the room, her eyes calm, observant, steady. Victor noticed immediately. He always did. His gaze cut through the room like a blade, landing on her with a flicker of irritation that quickly turned into amusement. To him, she didn't fit. And in his world, not fitting was a flaw that needed correcting. "Kitchen's not open to the public," he said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, his voice smooth but edged with quiet mockery. A few guests turned, curious, sensing the beginning of a spectacle. Emily didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a fact rather than an insult. That composure irritated him more. "Unless," he continued, a slow smile forming as an idea took shape, "you're here to prove you belong." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room. The staff paused just slightly, sensing where this was going. Victor stepped closer, placing a chef's knife on the counter between them, the steel catching the light. "Cook," he said, almost casually, but the weight behind the word filled the space. "My signature tasting dish. Let's see what you've got." A few phones lifted discreetly. Someone whispered, "This should be good." The air tightened, charged with expectation, with judgment already written across faces that had decided who she was before she even touched the counter. Emily looked at the knife, then at the ingredients laid out with meticulous precision, each component measured down to the gram, each element part of a dish that had taken Victor years to perfect. For a brief moment, nothing moved. Then she stepped forward, her fingers wrapped around the knife, not hesitant, not unsure, but familiar. And somewhere in the room, though no one could yet explain why, the energy shifted ever so slightly, like the first quiet second before a storm changes direction. The laughter did not stop right away, but it softened, stretching thinner as Emily Carter reached for the ingredients without asking a single question, her movements unhurried, almost detached from the tension pressing in around her. Chef Victor Laurent leaned back against the marble counter with his arms crossed, watching like a man expecting entertainment, not excellence, his expression confident, almost bored, as if the outcome had already been decided. Around them, the dining room adjusted its focus, conversations lowering into murmurs, silverware pausing midair, the subtle clink of glasses fading into the background as attention locked onto the open kitchen. One server whispered to another, "She does not even look like she knows what she is doing." Another replied, "This will be over in 5 minutes." Emily said nothing. She simply examined the layout, her eyes moving from the proteins to the herbs, to the sauces prepared earlier, taking in details most people would not even notice, the balance of colors, the precision of cuts, the intention behind every placement. Then she began. The first motion was quiet, almost invisible, but precise. The knife touched the board, and the sound that followed was not frantic or uncertain. It was steady, rhythmic, controlled, each slice identical to the last. Victor's smirk held, but something in his eyes flickered, a brief hesitation he did not fully acknowledge. Emily adjusted the heat on the stove with a subtle turn, not looking down, as if she already knew exactly where everything was. The flame responded instantly, rising to the exact level needed, not too high, not too low. A few heads tilted. The timing was too exact to be luck. The kitchen staff began to shift their weight, watching more closely now, their earlier amusement slowly replaced by curiosity they did not want to admit. A man at the front table leaned forward, whispering, "She is not guessing." Another voice answered, quieter, "No, she is not." Emily moved from station to station with an economy of motion that made everything else in the room feel slow, unnecessary. There was no wasted effort, no second guessing, no visible nerves. She tasted once, adjusted once, then continued, as if following a map no one else could see. The air itself seemed to change, the earlier tension replaced by something heavier, more focused, like a room realizing it had misjudged the situation but not yet ready to say it out loud. Victor straightened slightly, his arms no longer fully relaxed, his gaze narrowing as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed. This was supposed to be a performance, a brief moment of embarrassment, something to remind everyone who controlled this space. But the control was slipping, not dramatically, not loudly, but in quiet, undeniable increments. The room did not laugh anymore. It watched. And in that silence, something far more dangerous than humiliation began to take shape. By the time the aroma began to rise, it was no longer just a performance. It was a presence, something that moved through the dining room and settled into every breath, rich, layered, unmistakably deliberate. Conversations stopped completely now, not out of courtesy, but because no one wanted to miss what was unfolding. Emily Carter did not look up once. Her focus remained on the dish, on the timing, on the invisible rhythm she seemed to follow with absolute certainty. She adjusted a reduction with a slight tilt of the pan, letting it coat the surface just enough, then pulled it away at the exact second before it could overdevelop. A sous chef standing nearby frowned slightly, leaning in closer, his earlier skepticism replaced by something else, something quieter, almost uneasy. That timing, he whispered under his breath, but did not finish the sentence. Chef Victor Laurent stepped forward now, no longer leaning back, his posture sharper, his attention fully locked onto her hands. He watched the way she plated, not rushed, not decorative for the sake of appearance, but intentional, every element placed with a balance that felt instinctive rather than rehearsed. The plate itself began to transform from a collection of components into something cohesive, something that told a story without a single word. A woman at one of the center tables slowly lowered her glass, her eyes narrowing as recognition flickered across her face, though she could not yet explain why. Emily finished the final garnish, a subtle detail that most would have overlooked, but that completed the dish in a way that felt complete. Not excessive, not showy, just right. She stepped back slightly, not announcing anything, not presenting it with flourish. She simply let it exist. And for a moment, no one moved. The room held its breath, suspended in a silence that felt heavier than any noise that had filled it earlier. Victor approached the plate slowly, his expression controlled, but the tension in his jaw gave him away. This was no longer about proving a point. This was about understanding something he could not yet explain. He picked up the fork, hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second, then took a bite. The reaction was immediate, but not loud. His movement stopped. Completely. The fork remained in his hand, suspended midair as if time itself had paused. His eyes shifted, not outward, but inward, processing, recalculating, confronting something that did not align with his expectations. Across the room, the woman who had been watching closely leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough in the silence. That flavor profile, that technique. She stood up slowly, her chair sliding back with a soft echo against the floor. Every head turned toward her now, but her eyes were fixed only on Emily. That is not just skill, she said, her voice steady, certain. That is authorship. And in that moment, something invisible but undeniable began to crack in the foundation of everything Victor thought he controlled. The words hung in the air like a quiet verdict, and for the first time that evening, Chef Victor Laurent did not have an immediate response. He set the fork down slowly, not out of hesitation, but because something deeper had interrupted his certainty. Around him, the room remained completely still, every guest now fully aware that whatever this moment was, it was no longer part of his design. The woman who had stood up took a step closer, her eyes never leaving Emily Carter, her expression no longer curious but certain, almost reverent. I have tasted this before, she said, her voice steady but carrying across the silence. Not here, not in this restaurant. Years ago, in a private tasting in Napa. It was the dish that changed how people talked about modern cuisine. A faint ripple moved through the crowd, not loud, but unmistakable, like the first shift before something collapses. Victor's gaze snapped toward her, sharp, defensive. That is not possible, he said, but the authority in his voice had lost its edge. It sounded thinner now, less certain. The woman did not look at him. It is not just possible, she replied calmly. It is identical in intention, but refined, improved. Her eyes returned to Emily, which means only one thing. The room seemed to lean in, as if even the walls were listening. Emily finally lifted her gaze, not dramatically, not with defiance, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had arrived. She did not smile. She did not explain. She simply stood there, her hands resting lightly against the counter, her posture composed, grounded, unshaken by the weight of every eye now fixed on her. Victor took a step closer, searching her face, searching for something he could dismiss, something he could use to reclaim control. But there was nothing there except calm certainty. "Who are you?" he asked, and this time, it was not a challenge. It was a question he needed answered. The silence stretched for a single, heavy beat. Then the woman who had recognized the dish spoke again, her voice clear, unwavering. "She is not just someone who can cook," she said. "She is the one who created the technique you built your reputation on." The words landed without force, but their impact was absolute. A quiet gasp moved through the room, followed by something even more powerful than noise. Understanding. Victor froze, not dramatically, not visibly collapsing, but in the smallest, most telling way. His shoulders stiffened, his breath paused, his mind catching up to a reality he had never considered. Emily Carter had never raised her voice, never defended herself, never tried to prove anything. And yet, in that moment, she had taken everything he believed about status, authority, and belonging, and turned it into silence. The kitchen, once filled with confidence and control, now held something else entirely. Perspective. And just like that, the balance of the room shifted completely, not with noise, not with chaos, but with a quiet, undeniable realignment that no one could ignore. Chef Victor Laurent stood there, still close to the plate, but no longer the center of attention, no longer the authority that defined the space. That role had moved, silently, without announcement, to the woman he had dismissed only minutes earlier. Emily Carter did not step forward, did not claim anything, did not correct anyone. She simply remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if this outcome had never been in question. Around them, the guests began to react, not with laughter this time, but with something deeper, something closer to respect. A man at the front table slowly nodded to himself, as if recalibrating his understanding of everything he had just witnessed. Another guest lowered her phone, no longer interested in capturing a spectacle, but aware she had just seen something far more rare than entertainment. The kitchen staff stood frozen in place, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet awareness that they had been part of something they did not fully understand until now. One of the younger cooks glanced at Victor, then back at Emily, his expression uncertain, as if waiting for someone to explain how this had happened. But no explanation came. It did not need to. Victor finally exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, and straightened his posture, attempting to reclaim some fragment of composure. "If that is true," he said, his voice measured, but lacking its earlier sharpness, "then why are you here?" It was not an accusation. It was a question shaped by disbelief, by the need to make sense of a reality that did not align with his expectations. Emily looked at him for the first time since the dish had been finished, her eyes steady, not confrontational, not superior, just clear. "Because not every place recognizes what it cannot see," she replied quietly. The words were simple, but they landed with weight, settling into the room with a clarity that no one could misinterpret. No one spoke after that. There was no dramatic apology, no raised voices, no sudden shift into chaos. Instead, there was something far more powerful. Silence. The kind of silence that forces reflection, that leaves no space for denial. Victor glanced down at the plate again, then back at Emily, and for the first time that evening, there was no calculation in his expression, no strategy, no performance. Only realization. The kitchen, once driven by hierarchy and ego, now felt different, as if something fundamental had been exposed and could not be hidden again. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, one truth settled quietly into every corner of that space, unspoken but understood by all who had witnessed it. Talent does not ask for permission to be seen. It simply waits for the moment when it cannot be ignored. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again after holding something too heavy for too long. Glasses were lifted again, chairs adjusted, but no one returned to who they had been before this moment. Something had changed, not just in the kitchen, but in the way every person in that room now saw it. Emily Carter stepped back from the counter, not as someone leaving a stage, but as someone who had simply finished what needed to be done. There was no performance in her movement, no need for acknowledgement, no expectation of applause. She reached for her jacket, the same worn denim that had made her invisible when she first walked in, and slipped it on with the same quiet ease. A server nearby hesitated, then stepped forward slightly, as if about to say something, but stopped, unsure of what words would even fit this moment. Chef Victor Laurent watched her, not with resistance now, but with a focus that was unfamiliar to him, a focus that came not from control, but from recognition. "You could have said something," he said finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of its earlier edge. Emily paused, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, and turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. "Would it have changed anything?" she asked. The question did not accuse. It revealed. Victor did not answer, because he knew. The room knew. The answer was already there, hanging in the quiet space between them. It would not have changed the laughter. It would not have changed the judgment. It would not have changed the way they had all decided who she was before she ever touched the knife. A man near the back slowly shook his head, almost to himself, as if realizing how easily confidence can be mistaken for truth. The woman who had recognized the dish gave a small, respectful nod, not dramatic, not performative, but genuine. Emily did not acknowledge it outwardly. She did not need to. She had already said everything that mattered without raising her voice. Victor glanced around his kitchen, at the staff who now avoided his eyes, at the space that had always responded instantly to his command, and for the first time, it felt different. Not broken, not lost, but exposed. "Stay," he said, the word coming out more like a request than an order. "Work here, with me." The offer lingered in the air, heavy with everything it implied: power, status, restoration. Emily considered it for a moment, not long, just enough to be certain of her answer. "I already have," she said softly. Victor frowned slightly, confused, searching her expression for meaning. Emily stepped toward the door, her voice calm, almost reflective. "I have worked in places like this before," she continued, "and I learned something every time." She reached for the handle, then paused just long enough for the room to lean into her final words. "The best kitchens are not the ones where people are impressed," she said quietly. "They are the ones where people are respected." And with that, she opened the door and walked out, leaving behind a space that would never feel quite the same again. The door closed softly behind Emily Carter, but the sound echoed far louder than it should have, lingering in the air like a final note that refused to fade. For several seconds, no one moved. The kitchen, once filled with the rhythm of controlled chaos, now stood still, as if waiting for someone to tell it how to function again. Chef Victor Laurent remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the space where she had stood, his mind replaying every second that had just unfolded, every detail he had missed, every assumption he had made without question. Around him, the staff slowly returned to motion, but it was different now, quieter, more deliberate. A sous chef reached for a pan, hesitated, then adjusted the heat more carefully than before, as if suddenly aware that precision was not something to be performed, but something to be respected. One of the younger cooks looked toward the door, then back at the station, his expression thoughtful, no longer rushed by the need to impress. In the dining room, the guests began to speak again, but their voices carried a different tone, softer, reflective, as if they were no longer just observers of luxury, but witnesses to something they would not easily forget. The woman who had recognized the dish remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly sat down, her eyes still fixed on the kitchen, a faint, knowing expression on her face. "You do not see that very often," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. Victor finally turned, his gaze sweeping across the room, not with authority, but with awareness. For the first time, he noticed things he had never needed to notice before: the subtle tension in his staff, The way conversations had shifted, the way respect now moved through the space in a way that had nothing to do with reputation. He walked back to the counter, looking down at the plate she had created, still untouched except for the single bite he had taken. It was no longer just a dish. It was a reminder, not of failure, but of perspective. He reached for the fork again, slower this time, more intentional, and took another bite, not to judge, not to compare, but to understand. The flavors unfolded the same way, balanced, precise, unmistakably confident. There was no doubt left now, only clarity. One of his senior staff approached carefully, unsure whether to speak, then finally said, "Chef, should we continue service?" The question hung in the air, simple, but loaded with everything that had changed. Victor looked up, his expression no longer guarded, no longer driven by the need to prove anything. "Yes," he said quietly, then added after a brief pause, "but we do it differently." The words were not loud, but they carried weight, settling into the room like a new foundation being laid. No one asked what he meant. They did not need to. Because for the first time, the kitchen was not waiting for commands. It was listening. And somewhere beyond those doors, walking away without looking back, Emily Carter had left behind more than a moment. She had left behind a standard that could not be unseen. The night did not end when the plates were cleared, and it did not fade when the last guest stepped out into the quiet city streets, because something far more lasting had been set into motion inside those walls. The following morning, Laurent Atelier opened its doors as it always had, the same polished floors, the same carefully arranged tables, the same reputation that had drawn people from across the country. But beneath that familiar surface, something had shifted. The staff arrived earlier than usual, not because they were told to, but because something in them had changed, something subtle but undeniable. Movements were quieter, more intentional, conversations less about impressing and more about understanding. One cook adjusted a garnish, paused, then removed it entirely, realizing it did not serve the dish. Another tasted a sauce twice, not out of doubt, but out of respect for the process. Chef Victor Laurent stood in the center of the kitchen, observing, not directing, his presence no longer commanding attention through force, but holding it through awareness. He noticed everything now, the details he had once overlooked, the effort behind each motion, the intention behind each decision. And for the first time, he allowed silence to exist without filling it. A reservation book lay open near the entrance, filled weeks in advance, but among the names, one entry stood out, handwritten, simple, unadorned. Emily Carter. No time, no special request, just a name. Victor saw it, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow around that single line. He did not announce it. He did not react outwardly. But something in his posture shifted, a quiet readiness replacing the certainty he once carried. Hours passed. The lunch service began, steady, controlled, but different. Guests noticed it without knowing why. The food carried the same excellence, but something else had been added, something less visible, more honest. Then the door opened. Not dramatically, not with attention, just a quiet movement that could have gone unnoticed if not for the way the air itself seemed to recognize it. Emily Carter stepped inside, dressed the same as before, simple, unassuming, her presence once again easy to overlook for anyone not paying attention. But this time, everyone was paying attention. Conversations paused, not out of spectacle, but out of awareness. The staff did not stare. They adjusted, straightened, focused. Victor turned slowly, meeting her gaze across the room. No challenge, no test, just recognition. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Emily gave the smallest nod, not as approval, not as submission, but as acknowledgement. Victor returned it, equally subtle. No words were needed, because the lesson had already been learned. And as the kitchen resumed its rhythm, one truth settled quietly into every action, every decision, every plate that would leave that counter from that day forward. Greatness is not proven by who you can impress. It is revealed by how you choose to change. There was no announcement, no grand introduction, no moment where anyone declared what had changed, and yet everyone in that room felt it as clearly as the warmth from the kitchen lights. Emily Carter did not take a seat. She did not ask for a table. Instead, she walked slowly along the edge of the dining room, her eyes moving across the space, not judging, not searching for flaws, but observing with the same quiet awareness she had shown the night before. The staff moved differently now, not out of fear, but out of intention. A server adjusted a plate before placing it down, taking an extra second to ensure it was right. A cook wiped the edge of a dish twice, not because anyone was watching, but because it mattered. And in the center of it all, Chef Victor Laurent stood not as a man guarding his reputation, but as someone rebuilding his understanding of it. He approached Emily without hesitation, but without arrogance, stopping just close enough to speak without drawing attention. "You came back," he said, his voice calm, almost reflective. Emily looked at him, her expression unchanged, steady as ever. "I wanted to see," she replied simply. Victor nodded once, understanding more than the words themselves. "And?" he asked, not demanding, but genuinely asking. Emily glanced toward the kitchen, where a young cook carefully plated a dish, his hands steady, his focus absolute. "It is different," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than any praise. Victor exhaled slowly, a subtle release of something he had been holding onto longer than he realized. "Not finished," he admitted. Emily gave a small nod, the kind that did not reward, but acknowledged effort. "It never is," she said. For a moment, they stood there in silence, not as opposites, not as competitors, but as two people who understood something the rest of the room was only beginning to learn. Then Emily turned slightly, her attention already shifting away, as if her role in this place had always been temporary. Victor watched her, not trying to stop her this time, not offering anything, because he understood now that some people do not stay where they are finally seen. They move on, leaving something behind that cannot be undone. As Emily walked toward the door once more, the room did not freeze this time. It continued, steady, grounded, alive in a way it had not been before. But there was awareness in every movement, in every glance, in every quiet decision made without being told. And just before she reached the exit, Emily paused for the briefest moment, not turning around, not seeking acknowledgement, but leaving behind one final truth that settled into the space without needing to be spoken aloud. That day, Laurent Atelier did not become a different restaurant because of a new dish, or a new technique, or even a new standard. It became different because it finally understood something it had never needed to before. Respect is not something you demand in a room full of people. It is something you earn in the moments when no one thinks you deserve it. And from that day on, no one in that kitchen ever forgot what that looked like.